One family turned a broken realm into an empire, then paid for it in blood. The Romanovs didn't just survive the time of troubles, they engineered a new Russia, heir by heir. It began with the teenage Tsar, Michael I, chosen in desperation to restore order to a shattered state. Within a century, his descendants had transformed Russia from a feudal backwater into a European empire. Marriages became weapons, religion a tool, and reform a matter of survival. Peter the Great took this legacy to its extreme, taxing beards, crushing rivals, and dragging a new capital from the swamps of the Baltic. By the time his reign ended, Russia stood modernized and feared, yet haunted by the contradictions that built it. The Romanovs forged power from chaos, but their empire's strength came at a price. They left behind not just a dynasty, but a destiny that would destroy them. Russia crawled out of the time of troubles with scars on every province. Harvests had failed, towns were looted by shifting armies, and the throne stood open as rival factions pushed their favorites. Foreign garrisons and mercenaries moved in, while local militias fought them and each other. Years of civil war, famine, and invasion left a court without authority and a countryside without confidence. The state that once taxed, judged, and defended now hesitated. People fled farms, service elites hid on estates, and borderlands broke their routines. The system needed a center again, not just a name on a throne, but a structure that could collect, command, and keep peace. The hunt for stability carried memories of imposter czars who had turned succession into theater. After pretenders claiming to be Dmitri rose and fell in quick succession, the urge to gamble on charisma gave way to a quieter demand, a candidate no one feared enough to fight. The Zemsky Sobor, the National Assembly of nobles, clergy, and townsmen, met with that restraint in mind. They did not want a conqueror, they wanted a hinge strong enough to hold the door without smashing the frame. That logic pointed to a teenager whose surname was known but not dreaded. Michael Romanov was 16 when the Sobor chose him. His family stood at the edge of great politics, visible, with connections to old service clans, yet no army of their own. The choice felt improvised and precarious. The country needed the idea of consent as much as it needed a ruler, so the assembly's voice mattered. It signaled that power would be grounded in a broad nod from elites and churchmen, rather than seized by a battlefield proclamation. This was legitimacy patched together from institutions that had barely survived the turmoil. His mother, a nun under the name Martha, hesitated at the center of it. Twice she sent emissaries to decline, citing the danger in the family's vulnerability. Accepting the crown meant stepping into a crossfire of foreign envoys, hungry boyars, and unpaid soldiers. Only after weighing the risks did she push her son toward acceptance, turning maternal caution into political duty. It remains one of the few moments when a czar moved forward under pressure from a parent sworn to the cloister. The early Romanov program sounded modest, but demanded stamina. End the raids and skirmishes, reopen treasuries and courts, and knit broken districts back into the chain of command. They leaned on church rituals to sacralize authority and on the Sobor to broadcast consent. even as they revived the chancellaries that made those gestures tangible, offices to register dues, levy service, and relay orders. The aim was not grand conquest, but routine, because routine was what famine and impostors had shattered. Their claim to the throne rested on a genealogical thread. The Romanovs were distant kin to Anastasia Romanova, Ivan IV's first wife. That link, more archival than romantic, bridged the new dynasty to the last uncontested moment of old legitimacy. It was thin, but it was enough to quiet doubts among status-conscious elites. When Michael accepted, Polish troops still held Moscow's Kremlin, so his authority began under occupation. Coronation preparations went forward under watchful eyes, a reminder that sovereignty arrived before control. From there, the dynasty worked to turn ceremonies into actual power. These were fragile beginnings, a seed taking root in soil still churned by war. The promise lay in careful steps, a repaired calendar of taxes, guarded borders, and a capital gradually returned to its own government. He took the crown at 16, with hesitation still in his voice. Michael I stood in a city patched together after sieges, fires, and street battles. Coronation rites went forward under strain, because the realm needed a symbol that could be followed and an office that could act. He had no war record, no faction of hardened veterans. He had a surname that connected him to earlier legitimacy and a mandate to stop the bleeding. The task was blunt: restore order, feed the capital, quiet the garrisons, and make officials show up to work again. The invasions by Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden had left more than ruins. Moscow's neighborhoods bore burn scars and gaps where monasteries and houses had stood. Storehouses were empty, coinage was short, and local notables had grown used to acting without central permission. Foreign banners had flown over key towns, and their departure did not erase the memory of divided loyalties. The throne's voice sounded thin in provinces that had negotiated their own survival. Michael's first years revolved around ending raids, paying soldiers enough to keep them loyal, and reasserting a chain of command that had snapped in dozens of places. In 1619, his father returned from captivity and changed the balance at court. Patriarch Feodor, elevated by rank and crowned by suffering, became co-ruler in all but title. He chaired councils, signed instructions, and steered foreign policy with clerical authority. The partnership was unusual. A young czar with limited experience and a church leader who knew the actors across the borders and the factions inside the Kremlin. Together, they worked to restore a calendar of revenues and a schedule of service. Feodor's presence gave decisions a moral weight that raw force could not supply in those fragile years. Michael chose consolidation over glory. He revived the chancelleries that registered taxes, mustered troops, and judged disputes. Towns damaged by war received orders to repair walls and markets because trade kept the treasury from collapsing. Caravans and river barges needed escorts, so officials coordinated patrols and safe conducts along key routes. Foreign merchants were coaxed back with promises of predictable tolls, not sudden levies. In diplomacy, he reopened the doors that had been slammed during the Troubles. sending envoys to courts that once counted Moscow as a shaky partner. Contacts with Western Europe mattered for supplies, skilled workers, and credit. Guns, saltpeter, cloth, and artisans crossed the border in exchange for furs, grain, and duty concessions. The court learned to balance invitations with control, admitting foreigners where they were useful while guarding the rituals that anchored authority. Step by step, Russia's channels of correspondence widened, and embassies began to expect replies on time rather than months late. The emotional weight of the throne never lifted. Michael had watched towns fall and families scatter. Now he read petitions that echoed those memories. He leaned on confession and counsel, while boyars crowded the corridors with requests. Loyalty needed rewards, but funds were limited, so grants and exemptions came with renewed service terms. Even rebuilding spoke a language of necessity. The Kremlin's walls rose again, with stones taken from destroyed monasteries, a blunt sign that sacred resources were being repurposed to secure the state. Under him, the first postal service linked Moscow to other towns, giving officials a standard route and schedule for orders. Messages that once wandered for weeks now had stations, riders, and expectations. By 1645, he left a quieter country than the one he inherited. Garrisons obeyed, courts functioned, markets recovered, and the assembly could be convened without fear of chaos. The dynasty stood on firm ground, and a son, Alexis, would inherit not a wreck, but a framework ready for stronger tools. Alexis took the throne at 16, stepping into a state his father had steadied but not yet secured. The courts worked again, the armies obeyed, and trade routes reopened. But every gain relied on habits still being rebuilt. He read the moment clearly: preserve authority at the center, regularize service, and limit the space for local improvisation. He brought patience to the job and a clear preference for rules over charisma. The goal was simple to state and hard to execute: turn fragile routines into binding obligations. His program blended faith and governance. He cultivated a public image of piety while strengthening the tools of autocracy, nudging the court toward procedures that didn't depend on a strong personality in the throne room. That required paperwork, trained clerks, and fixed penalties. The chancelleries multiplied their ledgers, and oversight grew less episodic. Alexis wanted a state that could work on schedule. He made officials answerable to written norms, and he made those norms hard to escape. The turning point came with the Sobornie Ulazenie of 1649. It gathered scattered orders and precedents into one code, then anchored society to it. Peasants were bound to estates without time limits on pursuit. Service classes were fixed to obligations, and harsh measures against sedition made dissent a legal category, not just a political insult. Nobles gained predictability in labor and courts, and in return, they owed steadier service. The code tightened the link between rank and duty while shrinking local custom. It did not invent control, but it made control continuous. Alexis faced a religious storm next. Patriarch Nikon pressed reforms to align Russian rites with Greek practice. spellings, gestures, and liturgy standardized. Many believers saw this as betrayal rather than correction. In the split that followed, the Raskol built a stubborn resistance rooted in ritual and conscience. Old believers refused the changes, endured exile, confiscation, and at times chose death over compliance. Nikon's personal claim to authority swelled with the campaign, and his assertiveness triggered a clash with the throne. Alexis backed the reforms but removed Nikon, keeping the new rites while docking the Patriarchate's power. The church remained holy, but the state set the guardrails. While doctrine stirred unrest, the borders moved. The Khmelnytsky Uprising broke the old balance in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Cossack leaders sought protection and leverage, and Muscovy stepped in. Pereyaslav tied the Hetmanate to Moscow's orbit, and long wars with Poland and Sweden followed. By mid-century's end, left-bank Ukraine fell under Moscow's authority, along with key towns and river crossings that shifted trade and strategy westward. Each gain added resources and people, but also new intermediaries, privileges, and promises that had to be managed from far away. The ruler who prayed publicly also tightened inequality. The same code that stabilized society constrained mobility, and the same reforms that disciplined churchmen subordinated spiritual authority to the crown. Alexis kept a careful court and a keen eye for order, yet he enjoyed theater enough to sponsor Russia's first official performance, staged at his court, while conservatives denounced the stage as Western vanity. He kept a pet falcon, trained to strike jesters who overstepped, a sharp joke about rank that no one could miss. By 1676, he left a larger, more organized state with a thicker bureaucracy, a legally defined social order, and a church disciplined by secular power. The dynastic project had moved from patching a realm to shaping how people lived within it, and the cracks between altar and throne were now part of the structure. Feodor III came to the throne with a mind sharper than his body would allow. Racked by illness and limited mobility, he still pushed for order and improvement. He inherited a government that functioned, but he saw the friction points left by habit and hierarchy. From the start, he focused on clearing old rules that slowed decisions and blocked talented men from serving the state. He preferred written procedures and tested ability over pedigree, a quiet shift with large consequences for who could rise. His most striking move cut deep into noble privilege. The Mesnechestvo system, which ranked appointments by family lineage, had long turned command into a genealogy puzzle. Feodor abolished it. That single act removed a brake on merit and let the court place people where they were needed, not where their ancestry said they belonged. It sped up military and administrative assignments and sent a signal: performance would count. The chancelleries adjusted their rosters, and officials who once hid behind status had to show results. The old order did not collapse, but it lost a powerful shield. Administration and education followed the same line. Feodor supported the creation of the Slavonic Greek-Latin Academy in Moscow, a school designed to train clergy and officials beyond rote tradition. Its curriculum, rooted in classical languages and broader study, began feeding the bureaucracy with men who could argue, translate, and draft. This was not a mass education revolution. It was a targeted fix for a state that needed literate managers and informed judges. In the offices, clerks standardized forms, and councils handled paperwork with more consistency, reducing delays that once stretched for months. Feodor's court acted as a laboratory for workable practices. Dress and ceremony relaxed slightly to reduce friction between old and new habits, while edicts pressed governors to report on schedule. The army still relied on service nobles, but assignments shifted faster and inspections grew stricter. For a ruler so physically constrained, the drive felt practical rather than visionary. He aimed for rules that would endure beyond him, yet his health failed early. He died at 20, leaving a plan with only a few years of test runs and a family split into rival camps. The succession opened fault lines that had been papered over. Two branches of the clan advanced their candidates, the Miloslavskis for Ivan, weak in health but senior by birth, and the Narishkins for Peter, younger and vigorous. Court factions argued inside the Kremlin, while regiments of Streltsy, the armed guards with political ambitions, listened and chose sides. Accusations against the Narishkins sparked violence. The Streltsy stormed palace precincts, and Peter saw his uncles dragged out and killed. The terror of those days marked him, and it taught him how quickly armed guards could decide a capital's fate. Amid the turmoil, Princess Sophia Alexeyevna moved fast. She positioned herself as mediator and protector, then secured a regency with Ivan and Peter named co-czars. In practice, Sophia governed through her circle, most notably trusted counselors who ran diplomacy and policy, while she balanced the guards, the boyars, and the church. Ivan became a ceremonial partner, and Peter was pushed to the sidelines, sent out of the center but not out of the game. He watched, learned, and built small networks of his own. Sophia stood almost alone among women in Russian politics of her day. She even had her portrait cast in male royal costume, a pointed claim to authority in a world that read power through symbols. Yet her base was fragile. Failed campaigns weakened her allies, the guards grew restless, and Peter gathered support in the shadows. In 1689, his forces moved. Sophia was removed from power and sent into seclusion. The regency ended, and the path opened for the impatient observer who had been studying every lever in the room. Peter took control with the energy of someone who had been waiting and watching for years. After pushing Sophia aside, he moved fast. He trained with cannon, drilled with his play regiments until they were not play at all, and treated statecraft like a workshop. His goal was blunt: pull a medieval court toward the standards of Europe and make Russia a power that others had to factor into every decision. He valued skill, speed, and blunt enforcement. His answer to isolation was travel and study. In 1697, he left on the Grand Embassy, moving quietly through the Dutch Republic and England. He worked as a shipwright in crowded yards, handled tools, and took notes on rigging, timber, and pay scales. He toured arsenals, observatories, and manufactories, asking questions and hiring experts. He learned not only how to build ships, but how states paid for them and trained crews. He returned with contracts, specialists, and a list of things to fix at home. Westernization followed as policy. He forced court dress to change, cut long sleeves and old hats, and taxed beards to push a clean-shaven look. Etiquette in palaces and chancelleries shifted to a measured European style. Schools for navigation, gunnery, and engineering opened for the sons of nobles and promising commoners. He ordered foundries to standardize cannon, dockyards to produce hulls on a schedule, and clerks to keep accounts and forms that could be audited. A navy rose from rivers and then onto the Baltic, trained by foreigners and by Russians who had learned abroad. War hardened these plans. At first, defeat at Narva showed the cost of old methods. Peter reorganized, raised new regiments, made drill continuous, and put artillery at the core of operations. Over 2 decades, Russia fought Sweden in the Great Northern War. Victory at Poltava shifted the balance. The Baltic coast opened. Ports, forts, and supply depots turned conquest into administration. The Navy began to patrol in convoy as a system, not a spectacle. St. Petersburg came next as a statement and a tool. Founded in 1703 on wet ground, it demanded piles, canals, and endless labor. Officials drove the work with quotas. Deaths mounted from disease and exposure, but the site held. Shipyards at the Admiralty cut keels, warehouses stacked supplies, and ministries moved north. The city faced the Baltic by design. It forced court and government to look outward, and it trained them to think in terms of routes, drafts, and tides. Peter drove hard at culture and learning, but he ruled without softness. He created schools and sent young nobles abroad, then tortured and executed conspirators at home. The case of his son, Alexis, showed the line he drew. Suspected of treason, Alexis died after interrogation. Loyalty to the program mattered more than blood. He also crossed into science in a very hands-on way. He performed autopsies himself and used them to educate court physicians. Even in diplomacy, his presence worked pressure. At over 6'8", he dominated rooms and used his size like a tool. He died in 1725, worn out from work and war, leaving behind fleets, colleges, factories, a Baltic capital, and a government that acted with a new rhythm. The empire stood in European councils because he forced it there, piece by piece, with plans, taxes, and orders that did not waver. Peter's death left more than an empty throne. It exposed a system built around one will, now gone. Courtiers scrambled, guards watched for cues, and foreign envoys counted heads in corridors. No clear heir meant every salon and barracks turned into a counting house of loyalties. The new capital on the Baltic had ministries that ran on Peter's momentum, but the court in St. Petersburg and the old networks in Moscow both claimed to know how the game should proceed. The power vacuum swallowed certainty first, then restraint. Into that confusion stepped Catherine I, the woman who had risen from domestic service to become Peter's partner and then empress. Her presence alone signaled how social boundaries had shifted under the late ruler. She knew the people he trusted, the officers he promoted, and the schedules he demanded. For 2 short years, she kept the machinery turning. Shipyards kept laying keels, colleges kept training officers, and the beard-shaving etiquette did not fade. But real control slid toward the Supreme Privy Council. That small group shaped appointments, budgets, and diplomacy, and it treated the crown like a seal to apply after decisions were made. Autocracy kept its title, while the nobility tested how far their hands could reach. Her death opened the door to Peter II, a teenager born into grandeur, but schooled by courtiers with agendas. He moved court back to Moscow and spent time in hunts, balls, and carefully staged entertainments that let factions orbit him. Experienced officials struggled to secure consistent attention for policy, and cabinet plans stalled or shifted with whoever had his ear that week. Before he formed his own circle or agenda, smallpox ended his reign. The line of succession, already thin, broke into branches that had only proximity and memory to recommend them. The elite chose Anna, the widowed duchess from Courland and niece of Peter the Great, as a compromise figure. They invited her under conditions designed to freeze the council's gains, limits on war, appointments, and expenditures without their approval. She reached Moscow and then tore up the constraints, restoring full autocratic authority. That gesture reset the relationship between crown and council and told every petitioner that favors would be personal again. Anna brought with her advisors from the Baltic, especially Ernst Byron and his associates, whose accents and methods irritated many Russian nobles. Posts, pensions, and surveillance reflected their influence. The court spoke multiple languages, and the distance between ruler and old families grew. Decisions blended careful paperwork with the ruler's taste for spectacle and control. The atmosphere tilted toward severity. Punishments landed hard, banishments multiplied, and loyalty required visible displays. Court life under Anna gained a reputation for extremes. She ordered elaborate amusements that tested subjects' patience and dignity. The notorious Ice Palace wedding forced a nobleman into a sham marriage with a court jester and confined the couple in a building of frozen blocks, down to the bedding. These set pieces announced who commanded and who complied. Meanwhile, the army swelled into one of Europe's largest on paper, drilled and supplied, yet rarely sent into major campaigns. The force projected intimidation more than policy. Inside the Kremlin precincts, Anna even kept a private zoo and staged antics that blurred entertainment and humiliation, with courtiers roped into playing along. When she died in 1740, she named her infant grandnephew, Ivan VI, as successor. A baby on the throne meant every adult near it might claim to act for him. The empire had ships, colleges, regiments, and ledgers, but the question of who held the pen returned, sharper than before. The coup of 1741 began with the door opening in a barracks and a name that still carried weight. Elizabeth Petrovna moved through the ranks, called on the memory of her father, and took the throne from the infant Ivan VI. Guards shifted sides, ministers who hesitated stepped aside. The transfer felt abrupt, but it solved a year of uncertainty. It also brought back a brand of court theater that the empire understood, a ruler who drew power from lineage, style, and command of the capital. Elizabeth governed with a mix of charm and calculation. She knew how to work a room, but she also knew which levers mattered. the guards, the chancellaries, and the clergy. She replaced hostile officials without tearing up the machinery, then signaled a new tone. Executions stopped. She abolished capital punishment, a rare step for the age, and relied on exile, service, and confiscation instead. Courts shifted their penalties, prisons adjusted their routines, and the message spread that the state would punish without killing. The court changed character. Music, theater, and architecture took center stage, and St. Petersburg surged ahead as a showpiece. Elizabeth funded palaces, churches, and academies in a consistent Baroque style. Builders and artists arrived with contracts and deadlines. Workshops trained stonemasons and carvers to meet the new demand. The Winter Palace rose as a residence and a statement about imperial confidence. Interiors set standards for taste. The city's skyline acquired rhythm and color, and official ceremonies leaned into spectacle as a tool of authority. Policy did not vanish beneath the glitter. Elizabeth relied on strong administrators, including Alexis Bestujev-Rayumin, to anchor foreign affairs and keep ledgers balanced. Dispatches moved between St. Petersburg, Vienna, London, Paris, and Berlin as Russia positioned itself in European disputes. During the War of Austrian Succession, she avoided overreach while keeping options open. In the 7 Years' War, the empire entered hard and advanced far. Russian forces crossed the Oder, occupied key Prussian towns, and stood within reach of a decisive outcome. Logistics held, officer corps performed, and allies took note that Russia could move armies deep into Central Europe and keep them fed. At court, the ruler's appetite for display set the pace. Masquerade balls filled calendars. Designers and seamstresses kept workshops running day and night. Wardrobes multiplied. Elizabeth accumulated more than 15,000 dresses and changed outfits several times a day. The volume turned clothing into an industry, with merchants and artisans feeding the demand for fabrics, trimmings, and jewels. She never married, a choice she framed as protection against outside influence. Courtiers read another motive: independence, personal and political. The blend of indulgence and resolve created a peculiar balance. Taxes were collected, regiments drilled, and the navy maintained Baltic readiness, while banquets and operas crowded evenings. The empire benefited from stable cash flow tied to customs, grain, and monopolies on salt and spirits. The arts flourished under contracts that guaranteed pay, and foreign performers found steady employment between campaigns. In the field, commanders learned to coordinate with allies and manage long supply lines. Near the end of the 7 Years' War, Russia's position looked strong, but the ruler's sudden death snapped the thread of policy. Gains on the map became bargaining chips for someone else to spend. She left behind a court that had learned to perform power and a capital that looked and worked like a European city, ready for the next ruler to redefine its purpose. She moved before dawn with a few trusted guards, and by nightfall, the palace keys changed hands. Catherine, a German-born consort with a careful network among the guards, deposed Peter III after months on the throne. The coup ran on secrecy, officers' pledges, and speed. Priests blessed her as autocrat, courtiers adjusted their loyalties, and orders went out to secure regiments, arsenals, and the treasury. In hours, she shifted from precarious spouse to the central figure of state, and she kept it by working, reading reports late, calling councils early, and learning the rhythms that held the capital together. Catherine styled herself as enlightened ruler. She wrote to leading thinkers in France, traded ideas on law and education, and used their language to boost her legitimacy. She drafted a legislative guide that drew on European theory, pressed for clearer courts, and publicized the idea that a monarch should govern through laws, not whims. She set up commissions to hear grievances, then used their findings to refine decrees. The performance mattered, but so did the paperwork. Provinces reported in new formats, ministries learned to answer on schedule. Administration became her daily field. She redrew provincial boundaries to make districts easier to govern, created governors general with defined powers, and required annual reviews. She expanded schools, supported a printing culture, and encouraged the arts and sciences through stipends and exhibitions. Girls' institutes trained a first generation of educated women for service and teaching. The court became a magnet for architects, composers, and naturalists. Collections grew into institutions. Galleries and cabinets of curiosities turned into public-facing spaces that signaled imperial polish. Her enlightened voice did not soften her grip. When a massive revolt gathered on the steppe and in the Volga basin, she mobilized regulars, Cossacks loyal to the crown, and artillery to crush it. The repression was efficient and punishing. Leaders executed, communities resettled, surveillance tightened. In the aftermath, the estate order hardened. Serf obligations expanded, landlords gained wider police powers, and mobility shrank. Talk of reform continued in salons and in print, but the law moved toward discipline and revenue. Empire building ran in parallel. Russia pushed south and west on multiple fronts. Crimea fell into the imperial orbit and was annexed, opening deep water access and naval staging in the Black Sea. In the northwest, coordinated diplomacy and war carved up a failing neighbor, bringing millions of new subjects and key cities under Russian rule. Forts, roads, and depots followed the borders. In the Caucasus, treaties and garrisons embedded imperial presence. The map's new lines demanded administrators, surveyors, and cadasters. Catherine supplied them. She played Europe's game with patience. Wars were chosen for attainable aims. Treaties consolidated gains. Envoys received clear instructions. Subsidies arrived where they could tip scales, and alliances remained flexible. The court's credibility rose because she paid debts, kept supply lines functioning, and could field disciplined forces at distance. Recognition abroad reinforced authority at home. Her private rooms fueled stories, but they also served policy. Lovers often doubled as managers, diplomats, or governors, and she rewarded loyal service with titles, estates, and cash. Meanwhile, her personal purchases seated a museum of staggering size. The Hermitage began as a private cabinet and grew to hold thousands of paintings acquired from cash-strapped nobles across Europe, turning St. Petersburg into an art capital as well as a political one. She died in 1796 with ledgers balanced toward expansion, a court versed in European forms, and ministries that could run complex territories. The empire she left was larger, richer, and more tightly governed, its ruler's pen tied to Enlightenment language and state power in equal measure. The ground was already hot when the spark landed. On the steppe and along the Volga, debts piled up, harvests slipped, and landlords tightened demands backed by law. Cossack settlements felt squeezed by officials who measured their freedoms in permits. Serfdom had hardened under new statutes, and the promise of Catherine's enlightened commissions sounded distant in villages where bailiffs carried cudgels. Frontier garrisons complained about arrears and exile colonies filled with dissenters. The empire's growth brought new taxes, new overseers, and fewer exits for people who wanted to move or bargain. Into that pressure walked Yemelyan Pugachev, a Don Cossack veteran with scars and a talent for command. He took a bold identity. The dead Peter III returned to claim his throne. The claim unlocked old hopes. He promised relief from taxes, an end to forced service, and a reckoning with abusive nobles and officials. Cossack stanitsas gave him horses and men. Runaway peasants joined with smiths and boatmen. Bashkirs and Tatars, angry at lost land and heavy levies, found a common cause in the banner of a rightful czar who would sweep away decrees signed in distant palaces. The revolt spread in stages. Forts along the Yaik River fell first. Columns of rebels moved on the Ural works, seized weapons, and cut communications. The Volga towns became battlegrounds. Garrisons defected, then repledged, depending on who held the square at noon. Entire districts switched allegiance after Pugachev's proclamations reached their markets. For 2 years, the map flickered. At its height, his following swelled past 100,000, a moving mix of Cossacks, peasants, factory laborers, and tribal fighters. This was the largest internal rising Russia faced before the 20th century. Violence defined the contest. Estates burned, storehouses were emptied, and manor courts met sudden ends. Some nobles were killed in reprisals. Rebel chiefs staged executions to cement fear. Government detachments responded with raids that leveled villages suspected of sheltering insurgents. When towns fell back to the crown, punishments arrived quickly: whippings, hangings, and transport east. Siege after siege wore down the revolt's best units. Winter and distance helped the state more than the rebels. Once regular regiments concentrated, firepower and supply decided battles. Catherine did not see it coming at first. Reports read like local disorder until the scale became unmistakable. Shock turned into method. She mobilized experienced commanders, moved money and grain to staging points, and demanded steady reports. Officers with reputations for speed and discipline took the field. Step by step, they crushed the main forces, scattered the bands, and hunted couriers. Pugachev's flight ended in betrayal by former allies who saw the tide turn. Captured, he became a symbol for the state to display, and the revolt collapsed into tribunals. The impact in the capital was immediate. The Empress tightened administrative gears, cut the room for local compromise, and pressed governors to build police capacity. Surveillance expanded. Paris registers grew more detailed, and travel controls hardened. Estates gained sharper legal tools to discipline labor, while provincial boards received clearer chains of command. Enlightenment language stayed in her letters, but policy tilted toward order first, experiment second. The lesson she drew was that stability required proactive control, more watchers, faster punishment, and laws that left less space for improvisation. In the aftermath, reforms aimed at preventing another wildfire reshaped daily life. The empire behaved less like a courtly show and more like a system that logged, inspected, and intervened, an apparatus built to keep the peace by tightening every bolt that had rattled loose. Paul I entered the Kremlin in 1796 as a son long kept at arm's length from power. Catherine the Great's rule had stretched over decades, and her court shadowed him with comparisons he could not escape. Paul vowed to govern on his own terms. He moved fast to reassert the primacy of the throne, restore ceremony, and mark a clear break with the improvisations that had, in his view, let intrigue decide policy. The message was simple. Authority would flow straight from the crown, not from favorites, salons, or guards barracks. Order became his program. He obsessed over discipline, paperwork, and rank. He rechecked chains of command, rewrote service rules, and insisted that the empire speak with one voice. Resentment toward his mother's style of rule and fear of chaos shaped every decree. He aimed to lock the system against the kind of uncertainty that had brought rulers down. For Paul, legitimacy meant rules so rigid that plots would have no room to grow. The centerpiece arrived in 1797, a new law of succession. It established a fixed male preference line, moving automatically from father to eldest son, then to the next male in order. By ending the custom of naming heirs by will or court maneuver, Paul tried to close the path that had allowed coups and empresses to rise by factional support. The law bound the dynasty to a schedule of inheritance, not to the moods of guards or the favor of courtiers. He believed permanence would tame the capital's appetite for sudden change. He turned the same impulse on the army. Uniforms were standardized down to buttons and braid. Parade drills grew exacting, with steps, timings, and salutes measured in counts. Inspections became tests of obedience rather than combat readiness. Officers accustomed to flexible practices bristled under constant corrections, and nobles who prized autonomy found themselves lectured in barrack squares. Regulations stacked into manuals, and failure to conform invited swift punishment. Paul's own style added edge to policy. He issued decrees that shifted by the day, banned fashions he associated with foreign radicals, tightened censorship, and blocked young men from traveling abroad for education. Book lists shrank, and customs officials opened trunks for pamphlets as carefully as they checked for contraband. Provincial governors learned to wait for fresh instructions each morning and to revise orders by noon. The tempo wore down administrators and deepened the sense that one man's mood defined the law. Abroad, he startled allies. He broke with Britain and Austria, then signaled warmth toward Napoleon, gambling on a pivot that left generals and ministers guessing at the map for next month, much less next year. The change confused partners and risked the supply lines and subsidies that Russian forces counted on. Officers who had fought France for years struggled to square old campaigns with new directives. His private world showed the same mix of vigilance and control. At Gatchina, he built a residence like a guarded post, with passageways and sentries drilled to salute at short intervals. The layout read as a manual for survival, as much as a plan for comfort. Stories circulated that he once punished an entire regiment for sneezing during inspection, calling it a breach of discipline. Whether apocryphal or not, the tale matched the culture he enforced. The end came inside his own bedroom in 1801. Senior officers, long alienated by whiplash orders and public humiliations, forced their way in and strangled him. Before dawn, his son Alexander was sworn in, and the dynasty passed through another violent doorway into a new reign. He rose to the throne with the smell of candle wax and secrecy still in the halls. Alexander I knew the crown came through a murder in the next room, and that knowledge shaped his first steps. He spoke of reason, morality, and a better order, while keeping the guards close and the corridors quiet. The contradiction defined him from the start, a ruler who wanted to civilize autocracy without loosening his grip on it. He opened the windows where he could. Universities gained funds, new schools appeared in the provinces, and ministries tested procedures borrowed from the West. Administrative boards measured workloads, trimmed delays, and tried to get petitions moving on a timetable. With Mikhail Speransky guiding plans, the court discussed limits on arbitrary rule, a state council to regularize decisions, and a tax system that matched revenue to tasks. Drafts circulated that mapped how laws should be written, reviewed, and enforced. Alexander liked the language of rules. He hesitated at the moment of surrendering any real share of power. Europe did not give him time to think. Napoleon's armies moved fast and fought with systems Russia had not mastered. In 1805, at Austerlitz, Alexander faced the reality of modern war and lost to it. Command chains tangled, Allied coordination broke down, and a battlefield plan collapsed against an opponent who punished hesitation. 2 years later at Friedland, the pattern repeated with worse results. The defeats pushed him to the river at Tilsit, where an armistice turned into an embrace he did not trust. Russia and France posed as partners while both watched for an opening. The partnership carried costs. Continental policy forced trade choices that hurt ports and merchants. Officers who studied French drill still eyed French maps as threats. Alexander kept drilling recruits, buying time, and reorganizing staff work. The generals closest to him learned to supply large forces over long distances and to make retreat a tool rather than a shame. The lesson mattered when Napoleon crossed the border in 1812. The invasion hit deep. Russian commanders burned stores, pulled back, and refused a decisive trap. Moscow emptied and then burned. Supply depots vanished into ash. Kutuzov's slow retreat forced the French to chase shadows while their animals died and their wagons fell apart. Winter did the rest. When the army turned back, only a fraction remained. Out of hundreds of thousands, about 10,000 straggled home. Geography, fire, and hunger did what rank and file could not do alone. Alexander changed with the campaign. He moved from caution to resolve, pushed armies west, and took the war to the Rhine. In 1814, Russian troops marched into Paris, and a monarch who once doubted himself stood as arbiter among kings. At the Congress of Vienna, he pressed for stability built on borders, balance, and Christian principle. The settlement rewarded Russia with influence and security, while keeping France contained and Austria reassured. His empire had proven that endurance, supply, and time could beat speed. Peace exposed his old conflict. He endorsed piety and order more than blueprints for reform, distrusted crowds, and watched secret societies with unease. In his last years, he turned inward, traveled far from court, and withdrew from the rituals that had once energized him. Rumors grew that the Tsar did not die so much as disappear. Stories named a hermit called Feodor Kuzmich, who knew too much about palaces for a common man. The legend endures, and it fits the ruler who never fully resolved which Russia he wanted to serve. News of Alexander I's death reached the capital like a dropped curtain. Offices paused, guards waited for instructions that did not arrive. The legal path to the throne was unclear because the emperor had no child, and rumors said he had already arranged a transfer. For days, the court treated silence as policy. Ministers signed documents and formulas that avoided naming a sovereign, while regiments drilled without an oath. The empire felt authority hovering, but not landing. The confusion deepened when the private papers emerged. Constantine, the elder brother who stood nearest by birth, had previously renounced his claim, but that step was known to few and not broadcast to the army. Nicholas, the younger brother, understood the paper trail but doubted its power without public assent. He swore loyalty to Constantine, then learned the renunciation would stand, and prepared to accept the crown. The delay produced a hinge moment, 2 oaths in quick succession, each pointing in a different direction, and officers unsure which signature to follow. That opening drew out a movement that had been forming in barracks and salons. A circle of army officers, educated, battle-tested, and shaped by years of service in Europe, had talked about ending serfdom and forcing a written constitution on the autocracy. They wanted a public transfer of power tied to law. December brought their chance. They planned to block the oath to Nicholas and use the confusion to press demands in the open, betting that troops and crowds would side with them once the stand began. On the morning of the uprising, units marched to Senate Square and held formation without swearing. The air was sharp, the ground hard with frost. Deputies waited for a manifesto that never came. Envoys tried to negotiate. The lines wavered, then reformed. Nicholas moved artillery into position and called loyal battalions forward. A volley from the guns broke the stalemate. The formation dissolved, officers scattered, and the first modern revolutionary attempt in Russia ended within minutes of real fighting. Trials followed quickly. Leaders went to the gallows or to hard labor. Hundreds met exile and service in distant garrisons. The effect on Nicholas was immediate and lasting. He began as a hesitant claimant and pivoted into an autocrat who treated hesitation as danger. He built procedures around loyalty tests, tightened discipline in the ranks and made surveillance part of daily government. A new office, the Secret Police, collected reports, opened mail, and tracked associations across the empire. Censorship boards reviewed manuscripts and theater scripts, shutting down what officials deemed corrosive to order. He gave this outlook a public formula, a trinity that placed faith, sovereign power, and national character at the center of state life. Schools taught it, bureaucrats repeated it. Meanwhile, he pushed infrastructure with the same certainty: foundries, textile mills, and the first great railway linking St. Petersburg and Moscow. Schedules, timetables, and standardized gauges became part of official language. Modernization came wrapped in inspection and command. Nicholas handled the Decembrist interrogations himself and signed sentences that severed friendships. Abroad, diplomats labeled him the Iron Tsar. Within the ranks, soldiers joked about his love of the lash. In his last years, the system he forged showed steel and strain, a state that could move trains on time and silence dissent, yet carried the cost of wars that emptied treasuries and bled prestige. The stance held, rigid and heavy, as new pressures gathered on every frontier and in every ministry ledger. Nicholas I entered the 1850s convinced that Russia stood firm while its neighbors faltered. He saw the Ottoman Empire as terminally weak and expected the great powers to accept Russian stewardship over Orthodox interests. That confidence shaped his opening move, demanding formal protection of Orthodoxy holy sites inside Ottoman lands. The request triggered a hard pushback from Istanbul, and within months, a diplomatic quarrel widened into a multi-front crisis. Russia advanced at sea and on land, believing swift pressure would force concessions. Instead, it drew in rivals who had long feared Russian reach toward the straits. The dispute escalated beyond theology and shrines. Russian power near the Black Sea threatened shipping lanes and access to the Mediterranean. Britain and France, eager to contain St. Petersburg, joined with the Ottomans and brought naval superiority and industrial capacity. The war that followed, from 1853 to 1856, ran on new technology. Railways moved troops and supplies faster than old wagon lines. Telegraphs carried orders and news, and reporters sent dispatches to readers at home. These tools stripped away the distance that once hid battlefield failures, exposing delays, shortages, and costly miscalculations in real time. Russia found itself fighting alone against a coalition that could land forces decisively in Crimea. The Allied campaign focused on Sevastopol, the fortress port that anchored Russian power in the Black Sea. The siege lasted nearly a year. Russian units dug in and resisted assault after assault, yet the cracks in the old system widened. Supply trains lagged on poor roads, ammunition and food arrived late, hospitals overflowed. Officers trained for parade ground precision struggled with trench warfare and coordinated artillery. The defenders showed grit under bombardment, but the attrition grounded them down. Disease thrived in cold, wet camps. Winter storms cut lines, tents failed, and rations spoiled. More men died from illness than from shells. On the Allied side, organized nursing and new hospital methods took shape, improving survival and setting standards that armies would copy. For the first time, photographers preserved scenes of camps, batteries, and aftermaths. Those images reached the public and recast war as a visible ledger of bodies in mud, not only flags and reports. The contrast between heroic endurance and the waste of men stood stark. Even as Russian batteries scored local victories, the broader map turned against Nicholas. The Baltic and the Caucasus fronts sapped resources, and European capitals closed ranks. At home, the strain revealed deeper issues: outdated command structures, rigid bureaucracy, and a slow industrial base. Reports from Crimea moved with the wire, and bad news traveled quickly. Nicholas stayed defiant while defeats mounted, but the tone at court grew heavy as the siege tightened and Allied ships dominated the sea approaches. Sevastopol's fall signaled more than the loss of a stronghold. It forced a reckoning with methods that no longer matched the age. Negotiations produced the Treaty of Paris in 1856. Russia agreed to neutralize the Black Sea, surrendering the right to maintain a navy there and fortifying neither coast. The empire still stretched across continents, yet its aura of inevitability dimmed. Nicholas's era of rigid confidence ended in exhaustion. The task passed to Alexander II, who faced a state that needed faster railways, cleaner books, and a new approach to authority, or it would meet the next war with the same broken tools. Alexander II took the throne with battle smoke still hanging over the empire. The army limped home, the treasury sagged, and the Black Sea lay closed to Russian warships. He faced a state built for parade ground order and frontier expansion, not for railways, rifles, and public scrutiny. He read the balance sheet clearly, survived by changing, or watched the empire slip behind faster rivals. He chose to rebuild from within, beginning with the one institution that shaped every village, tax roll, and regiment: serfdom. In 1861, he signed the Emancipation that ended the legal bondage of more than 23 million peasants. The decree did more than declare freedom. It redrew ownership and authority in the countryside. Former serfs received personal rights and allotments tied to their communes. But land came at a price. Villages owed long-term redemption payments to compensate former landowners, and the parcels often ran small or poor. The law shifted the old chains into financial obligations, and local officials enforced the schedule strictly. Social peace did not follow. Rural courts filled with disputes over boundaries, forests, and pasture. Many peasants moved for seasonal work, returning home with cash and sharper expectations, and resentment traveled with them. He pushed a broader package known as the Great Reforms. Courts gained public trials, independent judges, and juries, bringing legal procedure closer to European models and limiting arbitrary rule by police. New local assemblies, the Zemstvos, took on roads, schools, and healthcare in the provinces, giving landowners and some professionals experience in administration. In the army, universal conscription shortened noble privilege and cut service terms, while training and logistics began to reflect the lessons of Crimea. Railways expanded, factories multiplied around St. Petersburg and Moscow, and a cautious press debate emerged under looser censorship. The state built capacity without surrendering the principle of autocracy. Ministers answered upward, not outward. That balance met resistance from multiple directions. Landowners disliked layers of elected bodies second-guessing their influence. Bureaucrats feared independent courts. In universities, a generation raised on new textbooks and public trials spoke in a sharper register. Circles studied economics, history, and radical tracks. Some students went to the people, hoping to stir rural Russia into cooperative reform. Police arrests, trials, and exile followed. A harder fringe concluded that persuasion failed where force ruled. They turned to targeted violence against symbols of authority. The Tsar became their ultimate target. Over the years, assailants fired pistols at his carriage, planted charges under streets and rail lines, and infiltrated palace routines. 6 times he survived. Each escape tightened security and fueled arguments inside government. Keep reforming to undercut rage, or clamp down to restore fear. He tried both. He discussed limited advisory councils, then signed harsher measures against the press and associations. He approved technical education and new rail subsidies, then expanded surveillance. The contradiction widened. His habits made him reachable. He walked the same routes inside the capital, rode at familiar hours, and trusted a corps of guards who knew his schedule. On March 13, 1881, one bomb wounded bystanders and halted the carriage. He stepped out to aid the injured. A second device exploded at his feet. Bleeding but conscious, he was carried to the Winter Palace, where doctors worked in vain. With him died the hope that the throne could manage transformation by decree while holding the old order intact. His son, Alexander III, would inherit both the machinery of reform and the fear it unleashed, and chose steel over compromise the moment he grasped the crown. In 1861, the emperor signed the Emancipation Manifesto and a stack of related statutes, releasing more than 23 million people from legal bondage. The decree reached provinces by courier and proclamation. Village elders gathered in churches and assembly huts to hear it read aloud. For many, freedom began as a sound, the drone of an official text, the crackle of seals and ribbons, and then a pause as men and women tried to grasp what personal liberty meant after generations of inherited obligation. Joy mixed with caution. Families still stood on the same plots, with the same tools and the same winters ahead. The decision did not come from sentiment. The Crimean War had revealed a hard truth. An empire tied to coerced labor struggled to supply a modern army, build rails fast enough, and translate orders into action. Ministers compiled reports that counted not just soldiers and guns, but delays, shortages, and missed harvests. Reform looked cheaper than defeat. If the state wanted a tax-paying, recruit-ready population, it had to recast ownership and responsibility in the countryside. The mechanics were technical and slow. Former serfs gained the right to marry without permission, to bring cases to court, to move with passports, and to own property. Land did not come free. Communes received allotments from estates, then owed decades of redemption payments to compensate landowners, with the state advancing the sum and collecting installments. Surveyors divided fields into narrow strips. Maps fixed boundaries that often cut across meadows and water sources. Many allotments were smaller or poorer than the plots peasants had worked, and forests and pastures remained contested. Local committees and mediators handled endless disputes over wells, paths, and access to timber. Freedom changed village rhythms. Peasants elected elders and judges for rural courts, kept communal registers, and negotiated taxes. Money entered daily life more directly. Seasonal laborers headed to cities and back again, bringing wages and rumors about factory work and schools. Some households improved their tools and livestock. Others sank under arrears. The dual legacy came into focus, a moral break with hereditary servitude and an economic burden that locked many into an exhausting cycle of payments, fines, and short harvests. The state widened reform beyond the village. New courts held public trials with juries and trained advocates, raising expectations of procedure. Provincial self-government, through zemstvos, took responsibility for roads, clinics, primary schools, and local statistics. Doctors and teachers, often young and ambitious, arrived in district towns and tried to stretch small budgets across vast territories. Censorship rules loosened, then tightened, but newspapers multiplied and covered debates about law, industry, and the peasant question. Universities expanded seats and curricula. Students formed circles to read history, economics, and science. Editors printed serialized textbooks and essays on law and agriculture. Discussion widened past estate boundaries. In some districts, priests served as translators of the reform, reading the manifesto in full churches and explaining how allotments and payments worked. On the day the edict was announced, villagers in certain places bowed to the imperial portrait and kissed it, expecting the sovereign to appear with deeds and blessings. In many parishes, long texts meant little without an interpreter, and clergy softened passages to keep crowds calm and hopeful. The irony grew clearer each year. The reform aimed to stabilize the empire and fuel growth, yet it taught millions to track rights, calculate costs, and judge officials. New knowledge did not erase hardship, it sharpened it. As courts, schools, and newspapers spread, so did the habit of questioning who ordered, who paid, and who decided. He took the crown in the shadow of an explosion in a funeral. The blood on the cobblestones from his father's murder was still fresh in memory when Alexander III swore that hesitation would never rule Russia again. He moved into power with a blunt promise to protect the throne by tightening every bolt the last reign had loosened. Ministers who spoke of consultation found doors closing. The new tone was plain: repair the state by fear, not favor; prize order, not experiment. From the start, he restored hierarchy as policy. Censorship boards gained wider reach and fewer exceptions. The Interior Ministry expanded surveillance, filed dossiers, and made exile a routine sentence for students, editors, and local activists. Trials of political cases shifted toward closed procedures. Universities lost autonomy, and police watched lecture halls as closely as they watched printing presses. Governors general received emergency powers to suspend newspapers, impose curfews, and move suspects without lengthy paperwork. His creed fit the apparatus. Autocracy meant power in one place. Orthodoxy meant the church aligned with that power. Nationality meant the culture of the core leading the rest. In practice, that meant Russification. In Poland, officials trimmed the space for local language in schools and courts. In the Baltics, German municipal privileges gave way to Russian statutes. In Finland, separate legal customs faced steady pressure. Clergy planted more Orthodox parishes along frontier towns, and state subsidies favored Russian language classrooms. These measures consolidated command but bred resentment among peoples with strong local identities and institutions. Yet the reign did not freeze the economy. Railway maps thickened, maintenance improved, and freight rates stabilized. The finance ministry pushed tariffs to protect infant industries, guided foreign investment toward mines and mills, and introduced new taxes to steady revenue. Heavy industry grew in the Donbass and along the Neva. The most ambitious project ran east, a transcontinental line that would bind provinces, soldiers, and grain depots from the Volga to the Pacific. Construction began in stages, often with shortages of labor and sleepers, but the target was fixed: link the empire's spread with steel. Publicly, he appeared stern and distant. Privately, he kept a quieter rhythm. Evenings leaned toward family meals, music, and simple routines rather than court spectacle. He kept a small circle and preferred constancy over ceremony. That reserve fed his reputation as a stabilizer after years of bomb plots and funerals. The nickname "the Peacemaker" reflected calm at home and caution abroad rather than softness in policy. He avoided major wars, kept borders monitored, and used rail and budget figures as instruments of strength as much as battalions. His life also produced stories that traveled faster than decrees. In one, a derailment shattered a royal train. With the carriage collapsing, he braced the roof with his soldiers while his family crawled clear, and the tale hardened into legend of brute resilience. In another, he dismissed polished European courtesies and cut straight to the lesson he valued. Russia must rely on the tools it could command, not promises from salons and embassies. Illness came hard and shortened his final year. The system he built continued to hum. Printers watched, governors empowered, rails stretching east, yet the chair at its center weakened. In 1894, he died, and the weight passed to his son, Nicholas, gentle in manner and thinly prepared for the demands that were already on the timetable. Nicholas II came to the throne young, soft-spoken, and unsure of his footing. The rituals of power sat on him heavily, and the old court watched a ruler still learning the weight of decisions. The ceremonies looked timeless, but the ground had shifted. Telegraphs, factories, and crowded tenements pressed close to palaces. That gap between imperial habit and a new urban country shaped the opening years of his rule and never stopped widening. Russia's cities swelled with workers drawn from villages. Railways stretched across provinces, and coal and steel output climbed year after year. Investors built mills along the Neva and in the Donbass, and state contracts primed arm plants for a modern army. Yet wages lagged, strikes spread, and peasant taxes funded projects that rarely reached the countryside. Police files thickened with reports on labor organizers and student circles. The monarchy tried to hold ceremony and modernization in the same hand, and the friction burned. His marriage bound him to Alexandra Feodorovna, deeply loyal and intensely private. Ill at ease in public and distrustful of whispers at court, she leaned on ritual, prayer in a small circle of advisors. After the birth of their son, fragile health inside the nursery became a state secret. Into that silence stepped a wandering holy man whose presence would later become a liability the regime could not shake. Early celebrations turned ominous. During festivities in a field outside Moscow, a number of free gifts sent a message of people surging across uneven ground. Tents collapsed, ditches vanished under feet, and panic spread faster than orders. More than 1,000 lives ended in minutes. The court continued with scheduled events, a decision that stained the moral authority of the new reign and hardened public skepticism. War with Japan exposed deeper flaws. The state assumed a quick victory. The navy steamed long distances toward traps. The army struggled with supply and coordination. Defeats on land and the destruction of a fleet at sea announced a strategic miscalculation and broke the spell of invincibility. News traveled by cable and press, and discontent at the front echoed in factories and barracks. Strikes, petitions, and marches followed, asking for legal protections and a voice in government. On a winter day in the capital, troops fired on a procession that carried icons and petitions. The shock tore through society. Under pressure, the throne conceded a consultative parliament and civil liberties on paper. Elections sent a flurry of parties and personalities into the chamber. Then rules shifted, vetoes mounted, and decrees sidestepped debate. The new institutions lived, but within narrow limits, and trust evaporated as quickly as it formed. Meanwhile, Alexandra's reliance on the healer, who seemed to ease the heir's bleeding, turned a private affliction into a public scandal. Court intrigue, rumors of bribery, and stories of late-night visits circulated through salons and newspapers. Ministers came and went under pressure from a man with no office, and each dismissal underlined the fragility of the center. The economy, however, kept expanding. By 1913, factories ran at scale, rail freight set records, and tax receipts reflected a vast market waking up. Yet the map hid uneven growth. Villages carried debts, housing in capitals crowded families into courtyards, and strikes flared with each downturn. The ruler's hobby, photography, filled albums with scenes of children, uniforms, and summer decks, a calm world inside palace walls while the streets grew louder. Then the continent moved toward war. Mobilizations pulled millions from fields and workshops. The ruler took command at headquarters, leaving the capital's politics to his household and the shadow court that had formed around it. Frontline losses, shortages, and inflation ate through patience. Breadlines and funerals multiplied, authority thinned, and the frame of the empire, long stressed by reform half-measures and hard policing, began to crack under the weight of total war. Russia slid from strain to breakdown through two wars that exposed how the state worked on paper and how it failed in practice. The first blow landed in the Far East. Plans rested on distance and prestige. Logistics told another story. The fleet sailed halfway around the world, only to face a prepared enemy close to home waters. At Tsushima, gunnery, signaling, and speed decided the outcome in hours, and the sea turned from asset to grave. The defeat shocked foreign ministries and sent a wave of anger through factories, barracks, and rural districts. Unrest coalesced into mass action. Strikes spread across industrial centers, rail lines clogged with stoppages, and sailors mutinied against officers they blamed for incompetence and cruelty. In the capital, the procession carried petitions asking for law, wages, and dignity. Troops fired. The shots tore open a political space that had not existed under the old rules. Newspapers, meeting halls, and street corners filled with arguments about rights and power. Soviets, councils of workers, appeared to coordinate strikes and negotiate with employers and officials. Local revolts flared and were put down, but they left a mark the regime could not erase. Under pressure, the throne issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties in a representative legislature. Elections followed, parties formed, and the Duma convened. Yet the machinery of autocracy remained. Emergency laws curbed assembly, censorship returned in new forms, and electoral rules shifted to favor loyal estates. Ministers used the chamber when it suited policy and dissolved it when it did not. The pattern taught activists and moderates alike that concession did not mean shared authority, only tactical retreat. When the continent plunged into war in 1914, crowds cheered and volunteers filled trains, but the early unity faded quickly. Russia mobilized millions faster than it could equip them. Ammunition ran short, boots wore through, and rolling stock buckled under overuse. Casualty lists lengthened, and letters home described trenches without shells and attacks without maps. Inflation ate wages. Cities struggled to feed new workers and refugees. Bread lines formed in winter streets. Corruption and procurement scandals undercut trust in ministries tasked with supplying the front. At home, the influence of a court favorite grew as the heir's illness worsened in private. Ministers were appointed and dismissed at a pace that paralyzed planning. Police reported that rumors about the palace spread faster than orders, and even loyal officials avoided defending decisions they did not understand. The emperor moved to army headquarters to direct the war, leaving the political center in hands the public doubted. That choice tied his name directly to campaigns that stalled and failed. By early 1917, strikes in Petrograd reached critical mass. Soldiers ordered to disperse crowds hesitated, then crossed over. Barracks committees replaced discipline with votes. Factories restarted only under worker oversight. As rail hubs faltered and messages crossed, the commander-in-chief lost the ability to project control. He abdicated in favor of his brother, expecting continuity. The brother declined. The dynasty ended with that refusal, and the throne stood empty. The family lived under guard in their own palaces, then in provincial houses. The provisional government tried to hold a war, an economy, and a state together, while rivals organized in councils. Authority fractured room by room, and the question of what to do with the Romanovs moved from file to rumor, while the capital's future shifted hour by hour. The abdicated monarch, his wife, and their 5 children woke each day to the sound of guards outside their doors. House arrest stripped ceremony down to schedules and permissions. Meals arrived on a timetable. Windows stayed watched. What had been a court became a perimeter. They kept routines because routines were the only thing they could still control, while the country beyond the gates unraveled. At the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, the provincial government allowed a narrow dignity. The family had rooms they knew, a park they could cross under escort, books from familiar shelves. Nicholas split wood in the yard, glad for work he could complete without orders. Alexandra knitted for hours, her energy uneven but her focus constant. Lessons continued around the table. The daughters wrote in neat hands, took turns at the piano, and helped with household tasks. Alexis, when well enough, read histories and built small models. A doctor visited. Priests conducted quiet services. Small markers of normal life signaled that the state still recognized them, even if only as high-profile detainees. The revolution in October closed that space. Authority shifted, and the new regime treated their presence as a problem to manage far from the capital. Trains carried them east to Tobolsk in midwinter, a journey of drafts, delays, and whispered orders. The house there was sturdy but plain. Guards rotated often. Rations dropped with the season and the chaos on the railways. Fuel ran short. The family warmed rooms by moving together and wearing layers indoors. Parcels from supporters arrived irregularly, opened and itemized by officials before being passed on. They leaned on faith and each other. Evenings settled into prayer, readings, and notes in diaries that recorded weather, illnesses, and the smallest kindnesses from a servant or a sentry. Letters, when permitted, carried calm words and avoided politics. The daughters mended clothes and copied passages. Nicholas maintained a log of daily walks with the precision of an officer, even as the distances shrank. He signed his notes as Nicky and addressed guards with formal courtesies, keeping the habits that had shaped him. By April 1918, the order came to move again, this time to Yekaterinburg. The tone changed at the door. Local Bolshevik command ran the house with stricter rules. Windows were painted over. Curtains had to stay shut. Speaking to passers-by through a fence risked punishment. Searches went from thorough to invasive. The sense that they might be traded or sent abroad faded. The family understood they were now assets to be controlled, not managed. The strain deepened. Alexandra's ailments, fatigue, pain, and bouts of anxiety became harder to hide in close quarters. Alexis' hemophilia flared after minor knocks, leaving him bedridden for days, while his sisters took shifts reading aloud and keeping him company. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia adapted to narrow rooms and strict lights out, but their notes grew shorter and more guarded. They recognized that release was no longer a likely outcome. Even in that setting, they held to forms of grace. Nicholas continued to sign letters as Nicky and called sentries Mr., never acknowledging in words that his rank had vanished with the abdication. The girls secured family jewels inside seams and corsets as a hedge against flight or bribery. Those stones would later harden into shields that blunted bullets and ricocheted shot. Whispers began to pass between guards during night shifts. Couriers came more often. Alcohol loosened tongues in nearby barracks. The sense of waiting stiffened into certainty that orders from Moscow would decide the end. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, the clock seemed louder with each hour. July 1918 pressed in on the Pugachev house in Yekaterinburg, renamed by its keepers the House of Special Purpose. Corridors stayed dim. Keys clicked, doors scraped, and guards kept their voices low. Inside, the family kept to routine, but the rhythm had changed. Notes moved faster between officers. Night watches stretched longer. Even the children sensed the air grow tight. The rooms stayed shut, windows were covered, and orders arrived more often from offices the prisoners never saw. On the night of July 16th through the 17th, calm settled like a warning. It was late, and the lamps burned low. Nicholas read from a Bible at the table. Alexandra prayed in the next room, then lay down to rest. The daughters folded their clothes and whispered. Alexis drifted in and out with pain in his joints and legs. They prepared trunks and coats, as they had many times, hopeful that movement might lead to exchange or exile. Sleep took them in pieces, and the house quieted to the scrape of boots and the creak of stairs. Around 2 in the morning, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant, came with an order. He told the family they would be moved for their safety. They dressed quickly. The servants gathered pillows and medicine. Guards escorted them down narrow stairways into the basement. The room was bare and cramped. A few chairs stood against the wall. They were asked to wait for transport or a photograph, depending on which guard spoke. Nicholas stood beside Alexandra. The children clustered close. 2 doctors and attendants took their places near the door. Yurovsky entered with a paper and men carrying revolvers. He read a brief sentence of judgment from the Earl Soviet. The meaning landed before the words finished. Nicholas turned toward him, confused, and tried to answer. The first shots cut him off. Smoke filled the room. Muzzles flashed against whitewash. The echo bounced hard between walls and ceiling. Screams overlapped with commands. Bullets struck bodies, ricocheted off stays and seams, and ripped plaster. The girls wore jewels sewn into bodices as a hedge against escape. Those stones turned some shots and forced the shooters closer. The firing stopped and started again as the haze thickened. After the first volley, bayonets and close shots followed in the noise and dust. 20 minutes passed before the basement fell silent. The work did not end there. The dead and dying were loaded onto trucks and taken out under a dark sky toward the forest north of the city. At a clearing near Captivity, the executioners tried to erase what had been done. Clothing was cut, bodies were struck and damaged to break recognition. Fuel and acid were poured to burn faces and hands. A shallow pit took most of the remains. A second site nearby received others to confuse future searches. Earth was thrown in, branches dragged across, and the road churned to hide wheel marks. They believed the precautions would hold. Years later, investigators recovered bones, buttons, and fragments from those pits. Laboratory tests in the 1990s matched DNA from the remains with living relatives, closing a loop the killers had tried to sever with acid and fire. One guard had kept a small souvenir, a button from the Tsar's uniform, that helped mark the trail back to the place. 3 centuries of rule ended below ground, in a room with white walls. The story outlived the empire. It moved in whispers for decades, then returned to public light as a symbol of loss and devotion. The dynasty that built an empire fell not on a battlefield or a throne, but in a basement, in silence, in a different country began at the door above those stairs. Crisis forged Russia's order, law, church, and power built to endure. Stability came, but freedom froze. Subscribe for more stories of empires, power, and the people who shaped history.